Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, today we have a discussion on Gandhian democracy. We will try to know why we need the democracy and what are its important features and how it has helped the world over, different countries workings. And as you know, India is the largest democracy, so we will talk giving instances from the India. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Ravi Ranjan. He teaches political science in Zakir Hussain College in Delhi University, and he is also a fellow member of DCRC and contributes in different journals on different topics. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Ravi Ranjan for the lecture on this very topic. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you, EduStat and CAC for inviting me to deliver this lecture on Gandhi and particularly his notions of democracy, how he conceptualizes democracy and why he thinks that democracy is the best way of ruling and how he conceptualizes democracy. So first of all, we have to concentrate ourselves, or we have to talk about what are the major criteria which is necessary for democracy, and if we will try to define the term democracy in larger meaning or in the simplest way, then we usually say that democracy is for the people, of the people, by the people. But now the time is saying that whenever we have to talk about democracy and idea of democracy, it is necessary to go beyond this definition of for the people, of the people, by the people. Of course, people participation in democracy is necessary, and that way democracy has been conceptualized by Greek thinkers and later on Western philosopher as a mechanism for governance. But slowly and gradually democracy not only work as a matter of governance or system of governance, but democracy also try to evolve so many social and political value which are philosophically grounded in our day-to-day transaction of human relation. So we have to understand democracy not only in terms of system of governance, rather we must understand democracy a core normative concept, or we can say a foundational value, and this foundational value is not abstract in itself. It is connected with the other foundational value of political philosophy, and these are equality, justice, dignity, rights, fraternity. So these are the value for which human aspirations have been continuously trying to evaluate and connect and reconnect the idea of democracy with these normative value. These normative aspects of political philosophy has to be grounded in cultural traditions, and similarly that's why we are having a different kind of philosophical tunings with the Indian philosophers and different kind of tuning of these values in the Western and Greek philosophy. But before talking about different traditions of philosophy and situating democracy in different philosophical tradition, first we have to think why or why not democracy. There are two questions that many people are saying that democracy is not working in this country because people are, at the time of independence, even our colonial masters were very apprehensive about the idea of democracy, and many of them many scholars has commented on this, and they say that it will be difficult for India to survive as a democracy for a longer time, because what are the parameters or what are the constituent conditions which is necessary to have a democratic system of governance is lacking in India, because there is diversity in terms of language, culture, language, culture, religion. These things will cripple India to develop as a homogeneous population, and without having since differences are there on these lines, it will be difficult for a government or for the state to hold democracy for a longer time. And examples are also saying that most of the South Asian democracy, or most of the countries of Asia who that have faced some kind of colonial government in the past, they could not survive as a democracy, and our neighbor Pakistan, Bangladesh are the biggest examples where we have said that they are not having the stabilized democracy. Means although in Indian democracy also there was a 2 years period of non-democratic emergency, which was suppressing the people's freedom and people's freedom and their right, but even after having a 2 years patch mark, we are having a sustainable democracy in terms of electing government. We are already had 14th Lok Sabha elections consecutively without having any hiccups. States are having democratic governments elected by every 5 years. But we don't have any kind of dictatorial regime which can be said that this regime has now forget to value the democratic norms and democratic values. But now the question comes whether the democracy as a normative concept survived in other parts of the world, in particularly non-Western world, as it has survived or as it has traveled in the western part of the United States of America. So before going to the theorization of democracy, and particularly today topic is conceptualizing about Gandhian democracy, we need to answer few questions about the democracy itself. The first question is whether why or why not of democracy. We can say that democracy is doing everything, and people are fighting for democracy. All struggles are fought in the name of the democracy. But sometimes there is a limitations of democracy also, and that limitations particularly come when we used to think democracy only in terms of system of governance and not beyond that. Even therefore, we have to think democracy in as a complex or as a multi-layered concept. We can say as a multi-layered concept which has many meanings to be derived. But one thing is clear, that it is still the best form of government available to the humankind. Democracy is much beyond for the people, of the people, and by the people, and it has been largely studied as a mechanism to organize governance. But however, it is a much larger value. As I have already explained, it is a much larger value, and we have to treat democracy as a way of life, even in our day-to-day transaction, in family, in our office, in any professional places and public domain. We try to behave with each other or share the public space in a very democratic way by giving chance to other. We also try to include as many as we can do in our public sphere. So democracy has to be think much beyond the system of mechanism of governance. It is much larger value and the way of life whose ramification can be felt in philosophical, socio-political and economic institutions of the life. So it is not only the way of governance, but it is also affecting our philosophical foundations of life. Philosophical foundations means when we are talking about the life and how it has to be organized, on which principles it has to be organized, there we also need to have democracy, because the moment we are talking about organizing our life or organizing our system, we are not talking about single. So it has a connotation of common. So the consciousness of democracy is coming from the common consciousness or mass consciousness. So one person itself staying in any society or staying in any country can't say that I am democratic, I am non-democratic, because it is a value system, and I have already said it is much larger than the governance system, and it is a value system that has a capacity to be universal. So some kind of universality it try to, and that universality comes through the acceptance by others. So democracy has to create a value system, create a pattern of governance that has to be accepted by others. Otherwise, democracy has to face some kind of hiccups. In 21st century is widely claimed the age of democracy, because in 20th century many countries, even India, was under the colonial rule before 1947. So 20th century, half of the 20th century we have First World War, Second World War, and all these conflicts and fight all over the world was in name, either in name of colonialism or later on in name of ideology during the Cold War period. But during those period, countries were trying hard not only to make themselves a better functional democracy, but also they were trying, or the entire world community was trying, particularly after the Organization of United Nations, that every individual have some kind of human rights, and these human rights can only be valued and it can only be given to the individual as his claim of being human, only if we are going to have some kind of democratic setup. And democratic setup will allow people to have a right to speak, freedom of expression, their personal right as well as their legal and political rights, and without having these rights in a system, it will be difficult to operate some kind of democratic norms. So after the end of last century, and we enter into the new century, and we claim that from the in very reports of United Nations and UNDP, we are claiming that we have to fight not only to make 21st century age of democracy, but also we are governments through their initiatives, scholars through their writings, activists through their activism are trying to place democracy as a essence of life. So now democracy has become essence of our life, a day-to-day life and day-to-day value sharing system. In such a situation, we can claim that 21st century widely claimed as a age of democracy. There is need to reconsider our democratic agenda. Now question comes that if it is beyond the system of mechanism of governance, then how we have to conceptualize democracy, and for whose interest democracy is working. But these days we also have some kind of threat on in terms of democratic culture, that most of the time when we are counting democracy as a system or as a mechanism for running the government or having a governance system, then we have every fear to land up with some kind of minority versus majority or majority versus minority dictum. So in this situation, when we are talking about one versus another, and or one group versus another group, or one individual versus another individual, one community versus other community, in this way we can have democracy to just regulate the legal system in a functional way, but we can't have democracy in toto, talking about democracy as a way of life, because always the minority have some kind of suspicion and fear over the majority. And if we just we just use democracy as a counting or as a mechanism where we can just have the head counting system, then we are landing with serious problems. Even Iqbal, famous sire of the subcontinent, has one commented on democracy, saying that it is, if it is just a head count, it's not a system of governance which is designed or which has been executed in people with all its ethos. So Jamhuriyat, we used to say democracy is Jamhuriyat, जहाँ बंदों के सर गिना तो करते हैं, तोला नहीं करते. Means we are just counting the head of the people without having the quality of democracy in our day-to-day life. So we have to understand democracy at this point of time, and this fear was also scholarly reflected in the many writings of East and West both. And recently I will just try to quote one line from Professor John Donne, who is a Cambridge scholar. John Donne has rightly observed that while democracy has come to dominate the world's imagination, according to him, democracy is such a core or foundational normative concept which has already captured our domination or our imagination. So democracy has come to dominate the world's imagination. It has also aroused in some quarters fear and suspicion. So at one point of time, democracy is trying to dominate the imagination of the world. Every day to day, our imagination has been totally captured by the democracy as a system of value, or also by the democracy as a system of governance. So this is the one part of the story. The second part of the story, on the other side of the story, is talking that sometimes this democracy also creates some kind of fear within the people, that how they have to run their government, how they have to talk about their own value system, whether it is going to turn into majority versus minority system. Therefore, we must understand that democracy is not an end itself. So now the question is that even in recently many movements in India against corruption or any other movement is talking about that everything is can be justified in the name of democracy. Then we have to be very alert about defining and operating the idea of democracy. We must understand that democracy is not an end in itself, it is just a means. As a form of government, it is relying on the consent of the governed. So we are taking the consent of the governed to rule with a system or with a law govern. Democracy is a means of is a means primarily for fulfilling life and pursuing common objective. So some kind of common objective is there to be pursued. Otherwise, it can't be said that all individuals are having their individual notions of life, and they are not coming to assimilate other, or not they are coming to assimilate with others. Then in this situation, we can't say that we are functioning democratically, and now there is a question on such kind of democratic culture. So we have to understand this in toto, that why democracy is not only has to be recognized or explained in terms of mechanism of the government. Therefore, we must understand that democracy is not an end in itself. As a form of government, it is relies on the consent of the governed. Democracy is a means primarily for fulfilling lives and pursuing common objectives. It is this way democracy expresses human aspirations, which are judged to be universal. So whatever the democratic aspirations we are coming in public with those ideas of democracy or with the functionalities of democracy, one thing we must have to clear, that it has to be accepted by others also. So the primary difference between democracy and other form of government is that your proposition has to be accepted and respected by others. Then you can say yourself, that you can claim yourself that you are a democratic, because you have not only given an idea to other, but you are also ready to accept others' idea. So in this way, democracy always in our day-to-day life function in a much larger context. So we have to understand the context of the democracy in this view only. So after having the idea of democracy, that what kind of democracy and how we are talking about democracy, then we have to go to today I am not going to explain much about that, how the concept of democracy has started in Greek with Plato and Aristotle, and it traveled through the western part of the world, and it came to India as a form of government when our founding fathers, while writing the constitution, has debated about the democracy in the Constituent Assembly. But today we will try to understand that what are the different cultures of the world which has created the notion of democracy and distinctiveness of the democracy in that particular culture. And if we look at the history of our freedom struggle, we will find that the Indian democracy, which emerged after 1947 in the form of constitutional rule, parliamentary democracy, this has a reflections of Gandhian ideas, because Gandhi, as a leader, as a philosopher, as a activist, has completely dominated the imagination of our freedom and freedom struggle both, and he tried to define these concept of freedom, right, and liberty and equality by going beyond the Western established tradition of rights, liberty and equality, because in West we are saying that democracy has to respect the other values which are the core component of democracy, that is right, liberty, equality and fraternity. But in case of non-Western societies have the different trajectories of democracy, and the history of these non-Western societies, particularly their fight with the colonial power, and the process of fight has itself evolved or generated some kind of governance system which is not which was more or less guided by the ideas of modern West, but we can't say that it was thoroughly guided by the idea of the modern West, because many other cultural traditions and religious traditions was already there. If we see the Indian history, we have a tradition of Buddhism, Jainism, and these traditions were not only the reflections of religious practices or attack on existing religious Brahminical practices, but more or less these system of these religious traditions has also some kind of cultural reflections of governance and arranging the social process. So in this way we have to understand what kind of reflections we can recollect from the Indian tradition, and particularly from the Gandhian thought. So today I will try my best to connect the notion of democracy with the Gandhian notion, and how Gandhi has visualized the idea of democracy, which can be a functional democracy and which can suit to the Indian villages, because Gandhian idea was that since India lives in villages, we must have some kind of village rule, and that's why he talked about Swaraj and Gram Swaraj. and this village rule must work on their own tradition. Rather, we should not wholesale just adopt the Western system or Westminster model of the parliamentary system, which is going to understand our problem and understand our situation. So he was not exactly in tune with the Western notion of democracy. Gandhi has already reflected in Young India and some volumes of Harijan about the idea of democracy, how he is understanding democracy, and what are the ramifications of democracy for the future India at the time of independence. So Gandhi, if after the civil disobedience movement and reforms were on the way by the colonial rule before 1935 Act. In 1931, 7 May 1931, in Young India, Gandhi mentioned that there is no human institution but has its danger. Actually, he was not much concerned about the institutional mechanism of governance in the same way that Western model of governance were coming through the colonial process. So he said that there is no institution, I quote, there is no human institution, but has its danger. The greater the institution, the greater the chances of abuse. Democracy is a great institution, and therefore it is liable to be greatly abused. The remedy, therefore, is not the avoidance of democracy, but reduction of possibility of abuse to the minimum. So this is the idea that democracy as an institutional measure is such a big concept, which is not only can be defined by understanding the idea of democracy only, but it's also dependent and connected with the other normative concept of political philosophy. So it is very necessary to understand that it should not be abused. So he said that if and his direction was totally under by the idea of making democracy a majoritarian form of government where the head counts are more important. So he was always fearing with such kind of reflections on the democracy by the Western scholars. Secondly, he has tried to equate the idea of democracy with his idea of Swaraj, which he has largely explained in his book in Swaraj. So the democracy or the Swaraj of masses can never come through untruthful and violent means. So now he can say that any fight for democratic rules should not be based either on violence or on untruth. So the two philosophy on which Gandhi has worked throughout his life was the idea of truth, means you have to make yourself pure, and the pure soul is not only considering about himself or herself, but the pure soul is the soul of the society, and where the soul of the society is talking about. So here we can make an observation that Gandhian philosophy, when it comes to the idea of democracy, it was totally deviating from the line which has already been drawn by Aristotle, Plato, Locke, and other Western philosophers, including Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, the modern contractian thinkers, that this idea of democracy will not start from the idea of the individual, because if we see the contractual philosophers, they are talking about the individual liberty and how individual liberty can be arranged in a system of governance, and that's why Locke has reflected in his writings on two treatises of civil government that how self-realization can only be passed through the process of individual liberty, and this kind of individualism, according to Gandhi, was a major problem for the modern democracy, because this idea of individual and individual freedom is restricting individual from voluntarily acting in a social process. And Gandhi is saying, for me, freedom is all about the voluntary act, that we are responsible for the society. We are not only claiming our right on the state, but we must have to work in an environment of duty, where our duties is assigned not by only power, but as a human being we have to realize that our right can only be performed in terms of our duties. If we are ready to perform our duty without any hiccup, we will at the end we will feel that we have also enjoyed our right simultaneously. So here is a question that how it can be started, whether individual is important like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, or whether the society or the community is more important like Marx. or like Gandhi, that now there is a difference of communal way of living in terms of Marx and in terms of Gandhi, where Marx was contextualizing the entire idea in his theory of mode of production. Gandhi was not doing the similar thing. Here, since our discussion is largely on Gandhi, so I will try to explain much about the Gandhian way of thinking about individual liberty and his or her responsibility to reconnect it to the idea of the democracy, because I have already explained that democracy in itself is not only a value, it is a core value which is consisting of many other values, or which is linked with the many other values, and its realization is not only depending on the idea of democracy, but its realization is depending on the idea of justice the society have, the idea of equality the society is having, the conception of rights the society is having. So democracy is a much larger value in that way. Gandhi said now if we go later on, then Gandhi tried to make a equivalence between the idea of modern democracy of the West and his idea of Swaraj. So Gandhi said, I quote, "The democracy or the Swaraj of masses can never come through the untruthful and violent means, for the simple reason that natural corollary to their use would be remove all opposition through the suppression or extremation of against us." So Gandhi said it is not, if we use democracy as a method of governance and particularly by using violence, what will happen? People will never tolerate their political opponent. So they will try to suppress the political opponent, or they will try to eliminate the political opponent, or eliminate the opposite view. So Gandhi said that it is difficult to organize democracy on the idea of or on any mechanism which is in a for a smaller gain or for larger gain using any kind of violence. So first Gandhi said that yes, liberty, equality and other values are important, but more important is that to achieve those values through democratic means, we must have to be clear in ourselves that we are not going to use any kind of force or any kind of violence or any kind of cheating or untruthfulness. So he is taking democracy as a pious value, and this pious value can only be maintained as a pious system of ruling if we are talking about other correlated value of the democracy. And for Gandhi, it was not for Gandhi, unlike the Western thinkers who were concentrating on the individual liberty, it was the individual voluntarism to the society as well as idea of truth and non-violence. After some time, again in Harijan in 1940, Gandhi said that, I quote, "My notion of democracy is that under its weakest should have the same opportunity as the strongest. That can never happen except through non-violence." So he is saying, unless we are not eliminating the power of force or power of violence from the entire system of democratic mechanism or democratic governance, it is going to be difficult for us that we are really going to have a true democracy. And without having a true democracy based on the idea of non-violence, we will be not in a position to protect the weakest of the society. So democracy will always try to help the stronger and crush the weaker. That was one of the tensions that Gandhi has when he was talking about the idea of democracy, particularly in the Indian context. So in 1948, after the independence, he defined the true democracy cannot be worked out by 20 men sitting in the center. So he is not saying that the democracy is all about just functioning of the parliament. Democracy is much beyond, which was my first proposition when I started this lecture. That democracy cannot be only taken or cannot be only explained in terms of system of mechanism by using a few representatives. So Gandhi said that in 1948, this is Harijan 18th January 1948, true democracy cannot be worked by 20 men sitting at the center. It has to be worked from below by the people of every village. So larger participation, and now the time has come that we have to go beyond the idea of participation in democracy. Rather, it should be an inclusive value. Democracy has to be in its inclusive value, that a value, whenever we have think of any kind of democratic ideas, any kind of democratic initiative by the government, by the society, if we are thinking that it is not going to include larger number of the society, the essence of democracy, we are not maintaining the essence of democracy, and such democracy cannot function for a longer time. Now we have to see Gandhi and the Western notion, how the Gandhi and the Western notion can be interpreted in the Indian perspective. So Western right theorists, those theorists who are talking about the human rights and individual rights, Western right theorists beginning with Locke have affirmed that freedom is not a liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases and to be tied by any laws, but it is freedom under law, and the sources of civil obligation is founded in law. So this is John Locke in his second treatise of government. He is saying that we have to understand liberty not only as a freeness of one individual or free thinking of one individual, but it is also liberty under law. Means he has given the idea of a civil government which is based on the idea of law, and this law has to be prepared or has to be constructed by Lockean theory of consent, because he is saying that if we see Locke is saying that natural rights are right, liberty and property. So in this way he is talking about his idea of life, liberty and property, and this life, liberty and property is basically answer to the British demand that why we should pay tax to the government if it is not going to read our consent, and this theory of consent has been properly conceptualized by John Locke. But Gandhi accepts this. Gandhi also accepts some kind of regulation should be there, and there should not be liberty of individual in negative term only. But Gandhi is just going little bit beyond this legal framework or the contractual state that has been created by Locke argument, that once we have given the contract, our consent to the contract of making an estate, after that estate rule will be our guiding principle. So Gandhi is saying that Gandhi accepts this, that in an independent India obedience comes from voluntary. So if we compare the theory of obligation by contractual thinker, particularly John Locke, and the theory of obligation of Gandhi, there is a difference basis. For one, for Locke, the idea of obligation comes from the idea of law. There will be law and people are obliged to obey the law, because they have to think that at one point of time the law has been made only by their consent. So their participation was there in the making of the law, and this is the one of the principle that one can't go contradict himself or herself, and that's why they have to respect the contractual principles, and they have to respect the law, and they will use the law within the boundary, they will use their liberty within the boundary of the law. Gandhi is saying that no, in an independent India, obedience should not come from the law or the threat of law or the threat of penalty, because whenever we are crossing red light, we always have a fear in ourselves that no, police person will come and he will challan us, and that's why we are using that our liberty in the legal framework, that we will restrict ourselves for our liberty to respect the law that has been created by the contractual obligations. But Gandhi is saying that voluntary acceptance of the role of law, in making of which the whole India had its hand through its elected representatives. So kind of voluntariness, voluntarily I have to be ready that whatever law we have made, we will accept those laws, not through the idea of penal code or through the idea of punishment, but we will try to understand and accept those laws on the voluntary principles, that these laws are part of our social construction or part of our social thinking, and this law is going to answer our problems. So now we have to understand the Gandhian notion by completely contradicting between the individual and the social. For the Western thinkers and the Western democracy, the idea of individual is more important, and particularly his idea of liberty, and that's why we are saying laissez-faire state, welfare state, and again the regulated state, or after that we are having a rollback state where individual liberty and market principles are more important. But if we will try to understand between Gandhi and the Western thinkers in notion of the liberty, equality, and finally the idea of the democracy, then we have to understand dichotomy between the individual and the social. So when Gandhi is talking about, we have to we also have to be very alert that when I'm using the term social, we are not supposed to mix Gandhi completely with the idea of Marx, who is talking about the idea of common mode of production, where every individual is part of that commonality, and that commonality is coming from the idea of mode of production, which finally produces the theory of class. So we have to understand individual versus social. Gandhi valued highly the role of law derived from the popular sovereignty. Yet his concept of Swaraj demanded a form of social and political responsibility that Locke never required, a commitment that was much closer to Rousseau. Rousseau was some kind, through his idea of general will, he tried to make himself closer to the idea of Gandhi, but exactly the idea of voluntarism in the public life was purely Gandhian idea. Second, the obligation to change oneself and one's community for the betterment of all in spirit of social service. So no one is supposed to change himself or herself just for his or her own service or his or her own benefit. If we see the idea of Western individualism, and particularly the idea of liberty that has been propagated by the notion of state, democracy and rights, what are our individual rights? I say that an individual must be given the situation in which he or she can be better fulfill his life aspirations. So when I am fulfilling my life aspirations, I am hardly bothered about others' life aspirations unless others' life aspirations are not connected with it. So finally we have to see the gain of the individual. Gandhi is saying that is not the case of the following the rule. So for him, rule of law was not the idea of fulfilling individual rights or individual liberty alone, but the idea of fulfilling rule of law is connected with the community betterment and in the spirit of social service. So two things are important. So here we can see how the individual and social can be differentiated in two frameworks. One is using the framework of Gandhi, another is using the framework of individual, because I am particularly stressing on Gandhi, because if we will try to make Eastern and Western framework, then in addition to Gandhi we have to think about the many other political thinkers as well as the social scientists. So many social scientists who are writing from the subaltern perspective or from the perspective of Orientalism, they are constantly attacking on the Western framework of modernity. But here it seems that Gandhi was not talking just about making a case against, he was against the modernity, particularly the industrialization, if we see his ideas in Swaraj, but he always tried to find out the good aspects of modernity that can be used for the individual liberation through having some kind of social voluntarism. So this was so social service was conceived as a primary duty of the citizenship, the basis for realization of individual rights. So in Western framework, particularly in Locke and others, we have to visualize our rights or realize our rights in the framework of law. In Gandhian framework, we will visualize or realize our individual rights only by having a community service. So there is a difference. Raghavan Iyer, who has written extensively on Gandhi, said that whereas Western individualism emerged in modern urban society and is bound up with the doctrine of natural rights, Gandhi's individualism derived from the concept of dharma or the natural obligation. So we have to understand this notion of Western and Gandhian individualism, and Gandhi has gave the world at least two essential meaning, both serving his twin principles, that is the principles of satyagraha and ahimsa. So ahimsa and satyagraha has to be connected. Now we will try to understand why we have to, what is how we can define or realize the Gandhian notion of democracy. So Swaraj, the Gandhian version of democracy, Gandhi has explained his idea of Swaraj very carefully. The root meaning of Swaraj is self-rule. Swaraj may therefore be rendered as a discipline rule from within. So Swaraj is coming from within. It's not a rule which has to be imposed by a state or outside the external agency of the individual, but first it has to be internalized, and the independence has therefore Swaraj may therefore be rendered as a discipline from within, independence has no such limitations. Independence may mean license too. So he is trying to differentiate. Gandhi is trying to Gandhi has tried to differentiate the notion of independence, which is a democratic notion of having liberty, or the how the independent notion or so he tried to say that my idea of Swaraj is based on the idea of voluntarism, while the democracy, the Western model of democracy, is based on the idea of independence. So he tried to differentiate between that. For Gandhi, Swaraj is a positive aspect, whereas the independence is negative. The word Swaraj is a sacred word, a Vedic word meaning self-rule and self-restraint, and not freedom from all restraint, which independence often mean. He made this comment in 1931, having emphasized the interpretation of freedom since 1909 from the publication of Hind Swaraj. So after the publication of Hind Swaraj, Gandhi tried to conceptualize the idea of freedom, not exactly in terms of the Western notion of freedom, and his idea of Swaraj is idea of democracy, and that can be related with natural kind of obligation, where Locke is saying that political obligations has to be created through the idea of contract, whereas Gandhi is saying that it is a natural obligation that people have to serve others, and this serving others automatically establishing a different kind of contract, which is different from the idea based on the modern contractual society. So Gandhi's contribution to the democratic thought is the way he conceives his civic duties. He viewed the problem of democracy being that we discuss political obligation as if it were a kind of moral tax entrusted from us by a coercive government, rather than as an expansion of our commitment to uphold and improve the quality of shared life. So he looked democracy as a property of shared life, rather just a system of government which is recognizing the individual right and individual freedom. Therefore, many thinkers like Bhikkhu Parekh, who largely dealt his Gandhian idea in his book, the political philosophy of Gandhi. So Gandhian idea of freedom has to be conceptualized. And foundational values of democracy are the concepts of freedom and rights and responsibility. Gandhi's critique of liberal democracy raises other issues as well. Gandhi was very critical to the liberal democracy, and we know that today liberal democracy is the widely accepted form of government throughout the world. So Gandhi was particularly against the notion of liberal democracy, which is just concentrating or based on the idea of individual liberty and individual rights. Rather, he criticizes liberal democracy for being individualistic in the sense of stressing right rather than duties, and self-interest rather than collective interest, and materialism rather than moral legitimacy. So he tried to give some kind of prescription of ethical foundations on which democracy can be sustained in this country, where people are not equal in terms of wealth and not equal in terms of, and Gandhi said that even he was saying that the Constituent Assembly, which is before Gandhi left this world, the Constituent Assembly was already there, and the Constituent Assembly we were thoroughly discussing about the part 3 of the Constitution, that is based on the idea of that is talking about the idea of fundamental rights. Gandhi said Constituent Assembly is discussing the right of the citizen, that is to say they are deliberating on what the fundamental rights should be. As a matter of fact, the proper question is not what the right of a citizen are, but rather what constitute the duties of a citizen. Fundamental rights can only be those rights the exercise of which is not only in the interest of the citizen but that of the whole world. Today everyone wants to know what his rights are, but if a man learns to discharge his duties right from the childhood, then he will also realize that he is exercising his rights too. So Gandhi's theory of right and Gandhi's theory of liberty has to be taken care of while dealing into the idea of modern democracy, particularly democracy in the context of India. So Indian democracy needs to be redefined from both. There are nationalist historians who are talking about Gandhi and the freedom movement, and they are trying to put Gandhian idea of democracy. There are also subaltern subaltern political historians and political scientists who are using the idea of political and civil society, particularly Partha Chatterjee in his writing. He has tried to understand the notion of civic society or civil society in terms of democracy. But we have to consolidate all the frameworks that are available to us to understand the democracy. But one thing is very clear, that these frameworks are slightly has to be connected to the other framework also, and particularly since Gandhi has tried to understand the nerve of the people, and that's why he created such a huge fanfare, or you can say huge followers. And lastly he said that my life is my message. So we have to take out from his understanding, not only as an activist of the social movement, but Gandhi was also a philosopher and writer, that has been already reflected in many of his writings, particularly in autobiography and in Swaraj. So from where we have to extract the idea of democracy, and what are the good elements from the Gandhian democracy can be implemented with the idea of modern democracy that Indian state is practicing, and then we can make a purposeful democratic setup and a good democratic culture that can enhance the participation and inclusion of larger masses. Thank you very much.
So what we conclude from the lecture, that Gandhian democracy different largely from two elements. One is the Swaraj and other is the participation of the people. That is more requirement of the we can say the major elements of the Gandhian democracy.
No, Gandhi has tried to conceptualize the idea of democracy in the form of Swaraj. Whether the modern democracy, the democracy is a modern idea, and as a modern idea, democracy is based on the other normative concept like liberty, rights, but
and they all are
individual
ideal in nature, which cannot be achieved.
No, they are Gandhi is also talking about something ideal in nature, but what is the criteria is that for Gandhi is saying that rights are always individual. And that's why there are limitations, because we do not know what ultimately individual wants. He will always try to glorify himself to have everything of the world. But what Gandhi is saying, that before your right, you must have to realize that you are not as individual, but you are part of the social. And being part of the social, you have a voluntary duty towards the society. So practicing of duty can realize the rights. But Western thinkers are saying that no, it is the rights, and for realizing the rights, you have a system of law and you have a system of governance which should be based on the idea of democracy, particularly based on the idea of representative democracy. But Gandhi is saying that it is not the law, it is the voluntary nature of the individual which create an essence in individual to follow the rule of law.
So, but this realization also need to be need to come at certain level. So how that could be achieved?
No, so Gandhi is saying that any system of government which is coming out from the contextual principles. See, idea of individual rights and individual liberty has finally resulted in the formation of contractual state, that is the modernization state. But Gandhi is saying that if we are trying to move from such contractualism, if we are going to move towards shared principles rather than the contractual principles. Contractual principles are also followed with a penal action, that you will be punished by the power of the state. So the moment a state is using power, a state is becoming violent. Gandhi is saying that we need to have a state which is not talk about any kind of penal action, because people voluntarily accept that they have done a mistake and they will try to improve themselves rather than using the force against the people. So because ramification of using the force is that force will be multiplied in many terms and it will try to oppress the people. So then there will be two classes of oppressor and oppressed.
So is that possible?
See,
go in real
one thing about that, we always say that Gandhi's ideas are so ideal that it cannot be practiced or it cannot be worked as a pragmatic idea. But one thing is clear, that in his political realm, when he was alive in this world, in his political realm, most of the time he used to stick with his ideas, and he transform the situation, handle the situation, and he win. It's not that he was completely a loser on his ideas.
Okay.
So
the crux is that could be implemented if the subject is right.
Yes.
His motive is right.
No, if individual is not only thinking in terms of rights, and state also has to take the corrective measure, because if we see the subaltern and in explanation of modern citizenship and idea of a state, then we can try to find out a connection, and then we can have a society which is not completely based on the idea of law or brute force, but also the idea of shared life.
So, well, friend, I hope you must have understood the topic very clearly, how it's different from other forms of democracy, and what are the essential features, and what the necessary things which Gandhi suggested for the now functioning of democracy, and what he practiced. So, I hope this lecture must be beneficial for all of you. So, I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf, I thank Dr. Ravi Ranjan for giving such a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.